The sun beat down warmly on the fishing village of Capernaum, a bustling hub on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was a town accustomed to the daily grind of fishermen hauling their nets, merchants bartering in the marketplace, and Roman soldiers patrolling the stone streets. Yet on this particular day, the ordinary rhythm of life had ground to a halt. The air was thick with an electric anticipation. Word had spread like wildfire through the narrow alleyways. Jesus of Nazareth had returned. He had become a beacon of hope in a land heavily burdened by illness, poverty, and political oppression. Stories of his teachings, spoken with an authority unlike any rabbi they had ever heard, echoed in every home. More than that, whispers of his miraculous healings had ignited a desperate, seeking faith in the hearts of the broken. On this afternoon, Jesus was staying in a humble, modest house. As soon as the townspeople realized where he was, they flocked to the location. They came by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Men, women, and children pressed themselves against the sun-baked mud brick walls, trying to catch just a glimpse of the teacher or hear a single word of his sermon. The crowd grew so massive that it spilled out of the doorways and into the dusty streets. There was no room left, not even outside the door. Inside, the heat of packed bodies and the intense focus of the listeners created a dense, sacred atmosphere. Among the attendees were not just common folk, but also Pharisees and teachers of the law, skeptics who had traveled from every village of Galilee and from Judea and Jerusalem, watching his every move with critical eyes. The stage was set not just for a sermon, but for a revelation of divine authority. A few streets away from the teeming crowd, in the quiet shadows of a modest dwelling, lived a man whose world was heartbreakingly small. For years, he had not felt the earth beneath his feet or known the freedom of a simple walk. He was entirely paralyzed, a prisoner in his own body. In the ancient world, such an affliction was often viewed not just as a physical tragedy, but as a spiritual curse, a life relegated to begging and dependency. His days were spent staring at the ceiling from a worn, rough-hewn mat. But this man possessed something far more valuable than physical mobility. He had 4 incredibly devoted friends. These were not fair-weather companions. They were men bound to him by a deep, unwavering love and a profound sense of loyalty. When these 4 friends heard that Jesus was in Capernaum, a spark of audacious hope ignited within them. They had heard the testimonies of the blind receiving sight and the lepers being cleansed. If Jesus could heal them, why not their beloved friend? They did not debate the logistics or dwell on the impossibility of moving him. Their faith required immediate, decisive action. Without hesitation, each of the 4 men took a corner of the paralyzed man's mat. They lifted him gently, their faces set with quiet determination. As they carried him out into the bright Galilean sunlight, the paralyzed man looked up at the faces of his friends. In their eyes, he saw a reflection of the hope he barely dared to harbor in his own heart. They were going to see the healer, and they would not let anything stop them. The journey through the winding streets of Capernaum was arduous. The 4 men navigated uneven cobblestones, dodging stray animals and hurried merchants, all while striving to keep their friend's mat as level and comfortable as possible. The physical strain of carrying a grown man was heavy, but the weight of their mission pushed them forward. As they turned the final corner toward the house where Jesus was teaching, their hearts sank. The street was entirely blocked. A sea of humanity stood between them and the door. People were packed shoulder to shoulder, standing on their toes, craning their necks to hear the teacher's voice echoing from inside. "Excuse us," one of the friends called out, his voice hoarse with exertion. "Please, make way. Our friend needs healing." A few heads turned, eyes glancing with momentary pity at the paralyzed man on the mat, but the crowd did not part. They were too captivated, too desperate for their own miracles, or simply too tightly wedged together to move. The 4 friends pushed forward slightly, but it was like pressing against a solid wall of stone. The doorway was completely inaccessible. Doubt crept into the edges of their minds. Had they come all this way for nothing? The sun was hot, their arms were aching, and the barrier of people seemed entirely insurmountable. Many in their position would have accepted defeat, turned around, and carried their friend back to his quiet, lonely room, blaming the circumstances. But the love these four men had for their friend was not so easily discouraged. Where others saw a dead end, their faith began to look for a detour. Stepping back from the suffocating crush of the crowd, the four men huddled together, the paralyzed man resting on the dusty ground between them. They assessed the building. Like most houses in first-century Judea, it featured a flat roof used as an extra living space for drying crops or sleeping during the hot summer nights. Attached to the exterior wall was a narrow, steep flight of stone stairs leading upward. One of the friends pointed toward the stairs. It was a silent proposal, an idea so brazen and socially unacceptable that it bordered on madness. To carry a paralyzed man up those narrow, precarious steps would require immense strength and balance. Moreover, what would they do once they were on top of someone else's house? Yet, looking down at their friend, seeing the quiet desperation and flickering hope in his eyes, the decision was made. They grasped the corners of the mat once more. With grunts of effort and synchronized movements, they began the dangerous ascent. The stairs were narrow, forcing them to angle the mat awkwardly, gripping the coarse fabric tightly so their friend wouldn't slip. Sweat poured down their faces, stinging their eyes, but they communicated through silent nods, coordinating every step. Finally, their feet hit the flat surface of the roof. They were breathing heavily, their muscles burning, but they had made it. Below them, they could hear the muffled, steady cadence of Jesus' voice. They were directly above the healer. The door had been blocked, but the sky was open. Now, they just had to find a way in. The roof of a typical Galilean house was constructed of heavy wooden crossbeams, overlaid with tightly woven branches, thatched reeds, and a thick layer of dried mud and clay. It was solid enough to walk on, designed to keep out the harsh rains. To breach it meant destroying someone's property. It meant causing a massive disruption. The four men didn't care about the consequences. Kneeling on the hard clay, they began to dig. They used their bare hands, prying away the hardened mud, their fingernails cracking and bleeding. They pulled at the thick thatch and snapped the interwoven branches, tossing the debris aside. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted. Jesus was in the middle of a profound teaching, the room hanging on his every syllable, when a strange scratching sound came from above. Then, a small shower of dust drifted down from the ceiling. The crowd looked up in confusion. The scratching turned into loud thumping and the sound of breaking wood. Chunks of dried clay and debris began to fall, raining down on the Pharisees and the listeners, forcing them to shield their faces. Suddenly, a blinding beam of sunlight pierced the dimly lit room. The hole grew larger and larger until it was wide enough to fit a man. The crowd gasped in shock, murmuring in indignation at the audacity of the intrusion. Silently, carefully, the four friends lowered the mat through the gaping hole in the roof, using ropes tied to the corners. Down, down the paralyzed man went, descending past the shocked faces of the religious leaders, until he landed gently on the floor, right in the center of the room, directly at the feet of Jesus. A stunned silence fell over the crowded room. The dust was still settling in the air, catching the beams of sunlight streaming from the ruined ceiling. Everyone stared at the paralyzed man lying helpless on his mat, and then up at the four exhausted, dirt-streaked faces peering down through the roof. Jesus looked up at the friends. The scriptures note a profound detail. When Jesus saw their faith, he didn't just see a broken roof or a disabled man. He saw the fierce, active, barrier-breaking faith of four friends who believed he was the only answer. Jesus turned his warm, compassionate gaze to the man on the floor. The crowd waited with bated breath for the command of physical healing. Instead, Jesus spoke words that no one expected. With absolute authority and tender love, he said, "Son, your sins are forgiven." The theological shockwave that hit the room was immediate. The paralyzed man's eyes widened, a profound spiritual weight lifting from his soul before his body was even touched. But in the corners of the room, the atmosphere grew toxic. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sat with hardened faces, their minds racing. Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? They did not speak the words out loud, but their silent judgment was deafening. They were witnessing a man claiming divine prerogative. In their rigid theology, Jesus had just crossed a line punishable by death. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent war between the radical grace of God and the rigid legalism of men. Jesus, knowing immediately in his spirit what they were thinking in their hearts, did not shy away from the confrontation. "Why are you thinking these things?" Jesus asked, his voice steady and calm, echoing in the quiet room. "Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat, and walk'?" The Pharisees remained stubbornly silent. It was a brilliant, trapping question. To say, "Your sins are forgiven," is easy because it is invisible. No one can prove or disprove it in the moment. To say, "Get up and walk," carries the immediate, visible risk of failure. If Jesus spoke the physical command and the man remained paralyzed, he would be exposed as a fraud. Jesus let the silence linger for a moment, making sure the gravity of his next action was entirely understood. "But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he declared. He then turned away from the skeptics and looked back down at the paralyzed man. The room held its breath. The four friends on the roof leaned over the edge, their hearts pounding in their chests. With a voice that carried the very power of creation, Jesus issued the command. "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." For a split second, time seemed to stand still. Then, muscles that had been atrophied and dead for years began to twitch. The man's hands pushed against the dirt floor. Slowly, miraculously, he pushed himself up to his knees, and then he stood firm on his own 2 feet. The paralyzed man stood tall, testing the weight on his legs. He looked down at his limbs, then up into the smiling face of Jesus. He bent down, rolled up the very mat that had been his prison for years, and tucked it under his arm. The room erupted. The crowd, which just moments before had been a solid, immovable wall of humanity, now scrambled backward. They parted like the waters of the Red Sea, making a wide, clear path for the man to exit. Whispers of shock turned into gasps, and gasps blossomed into loud, joyful shouts of praise. The man walked out of the door, his steps growing more confident with every passing second. He stepped out into the bright Galilean sun, looking up at his 4 friends on the roof, tears of immense joy streaming down his face. He praised God with every breath, his voice echoing off the stone walls of Capernaum. Back inside the house, the religious leaders sat in stunned silence, their theological boxes entirely shattered by the undeniable reality of the miracle. The ordinary townspeople, however, were filled with awe. They glorified God, turning to one another in utter amazement, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." The story of the paralyzed man remains a profound testament to the power of desperate faith and loyal friendship. It reminds us that sometimes we are the ones who need to be carried, and other times we are called to be the friends who carry the broken to the feet of grace. Above all, it stands as a beautiful revelation that Jesus heals not just the physical ailments we can see, but the deep, unseen spiritual paralysis of the human soul.